Rape as a weapon. Has the world failed to protect women? Our guest today is Monika Hauser, founder of the organization Medica Mondiale, which helps traumatized women and girls who live in war zones and conflict regions.
Hello. Und herzlich willkommen.
Welcome to the DW interview. I'm Alexandra von Namen. This topic has been in the news recently, with the brutal attacks by Islamic State forces in Syria and Iraq. Thousands of women, many of them Yazidis, have been kidnapped, raped and sold into slavery. Why do men do this?
Warum machen Männer sowas?
There's a huge problem right now with sexual violence around the world, but only some incidents make the headlines. There's also a lot of violence in so-called peaceful states, where people live in patriarchal societies. Of course, in conflict zones, sexual violence can be used strategically to achieve certain goals, to demoralize entire populations, to humiliate, degrade, or intimidate them. But women are raped in these situations simply because the men have weapons, and they can do whatever they want.
That's a pretty somber evaluation. You've been dealing with this problem for more than 20 years. Are you surprised that these things are still happening?
I'm not surprised that they do. We've been dealing with these situations for 22 years. Other activists have been working a lot longer than that to stop violence against women. I know what the reality is. I read reports, mostly from Syria, but also from the Democratic Republic of Congo and other conflict regions. The details in these reports are simply appalling.
For example?
I become extremely upset when I read about the rape of young girls. It's a clear indication of how brutal these men can be. They dehumanize their victims because they themselves have become dehumanized.
Have your experiences and research in this field changed your image of men in general?
Männerbild verändert?
I had always had a very critical image of men, so for me that's nothing new. At the same time, I think that people are not born brutal or violent. Their behavior is dictated by circumstances. I believe that a lot has gone wrong in this world in the last 20 or 30 years, especially as a result of the West's reaction to the 9/11 attacks. A lot of young men throughout the Arab world have been treated brutally, and they have no hope for the future. Still, it is the patriarchal systems worldwide that create opportunities for men to behave like this.
Your primary goal is to help women who've been subjected to violence. You've launched a new project in northern Iraq. Tell us about that.
We provide support for women and girls who are traumatized by their experiences. This includes direct psychological, medical, and legal support. We also help local caregivers to develop new skills. We're doing that right now in the Dohuk region of northern Iraq, in cooperation with the Kurdish government there. These local caregivers are often the first people that these women turn to. Many of the victims are Yazidis. The caregivers include doctors, nurses, and psychologists, and these people need training so that they can deal properly with the victims. They have to learn how to provide support, and they must do it with the utmost care and not make things worse.
So most of the caregivers don't have any experience dealing with these kinds of victims?
Very few people do. I'm sorry to say that even in Western countries like Germany, many of those who deal with refugee women don't have this kind of training. That situation has got to change. It's also important to train local caregivers in conflict zones, because entire societies have been traumatized and will stay that way for a long time. If we can provide trained personnel to help them, it will have a positive effect over time.
Wenn wir das Personal ausbilden, haben wir auch langfristig positive Effekte.
You've been working with female victims of violence for more than 20 years. In 1992, you heard about incidents of mass rape during the Bosnian War and decided to go there to help. That was a radical step. What was your primary motivation?
I was working on my degree in gynecology. But when I read these reports, I realized that I had to do something. I was angry about what was being done to women there, and angry that the international community and the aid organizations were doing nothing to help them. And I was angry about the lurid reports that I saw in the media. I felt that this situation affected me personally and that I had to go to Bosnia and do what I could to help those women.
And once you got there, was there a particular person or event that had a real impact on you?
I remember the entire year of 1992-93 quite well. I sometimes felt like a war veteran because I realized that I too had been traumatized by living and working in a war zone. I simply cannot forget what I saw and experienced there. I still have vivid memories of meeting nurses who worked at a hospital in Zenica, in central Bosnia. They really wanted to work with me. Many of the patients were Bosnian Muslim women who'd managed to escape the fighting. Some were pregnant and wanted an abortion, but the chief physician wouldn't allow it. The nurses talked to these women and learned that many others had committed suicide. The nurses decided that these women needed a special facility where they could feel safe and get the psychological and medical support that they needed.
You mentioned that you also felt traumatized at this time. How did you deal with your situation? Were you able to put those horrific stories out of your mind at the end of the day?
No, I didn't want to become cynical or just go through the motions. I've seen that happen to a lot of other people in this profession. That means that when you've come through a particularly difficult situation, you can't keep looking back at what happened. You'll feel like you're on a treadmill. You have to deal with it bit by bit. And quite often, your response is based on your own experience and your own feeling of powerlessness. So it's important for those of us who do this kind of work every day to pause occasionally and reflect. What role do we play, and how can we protect ourselves? But it's also important for us to understand why we do this work. Much of my motivation comes from the fact that my colleagues and I want to make the world a better place for women. I've met women all around the world, in Liberia, Congo, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and we talk about the successes and failures in our work. We're doing this not only for ourselves, but also for our daughters. To change things in this world, you've got to stick together. And we believe strongly that every time we help a woman in need, it makes the world a better place.
What has to change so that situations such as in northern Iraq, where women are raped, abducted and enslaved, no longer happen?
It's a very sad situation, and I am disappointed by the response of the international community. For 22 years, we've been reporting on the fate of women in war zones. Right now, we're working on a report that indicates that many Bosnian women are still suffering from psychological trauma 22 years after the fact. They are outcasts in their own society. So it's a double trauma, if you will. The UN has drafted proposals, and Germany has signed them. But no one appears willing to stand up and take action to change the situation. Some people have come up with good ideas, but where does the money end up? What are the priorities in this society? And as far as weapons exports are concerned, Germany, for example, is selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and other countries in conflict zones, and that won't help improve the situation of women there. And in these unstable conflict zones, there's an increase in the number of rapes, and that just makes the situation worse.
What specific recommendations would you make?
There's got to be substantial changes in foreign, security, and defense policy. We have to take measures to prevent conflict, and that means not selling weapons to Ukraine or Saudi Arabia. What we need is more diplomacy, and the situation of women in conflict zones must be monitored more closely. Also, women should be given a role in peace negotiations, and it's tragic that women haven't been given more of a say in how refugee camps are run. For example, there have been incidents of sexual slavery in Syria and adjacent countries. That wouldn't happen if women were allowed to help administer the camps. We've known about these problems for years, but no one does anything about them. There have been lots of fine proposals, but people don't have the political will to carry them out. And I'm still waiting for the German government to do more to help women in conflict zones.
Finally, we ask our interview guests to complete a series of 3 sentences. First, when my son talks about my work, he says,
he loves it and hates it. When I go to Afghanistan, he hates it because it's dangerous for me, but he also loves it because he knows it's my job.
If Chancellor Merkel were to call me today and offer to grant me one wish, I'd say,
I'd like to take her to see our work in conflict zones. If she could see that, maybe she'd change her policy priorities.
My colleagues and I would dissolve our women's aid organization if...
We won't see that in our lifetime. We'll stop our work only when there is no more sexual violence against women. That's our vision. We keep working even though we know that we won't reach our goal.
Monika Hauser, thank you.
My pleasure.